Okay, so this is session 6. Embedded Librarian shines a light on gray literature for informing organizational change. And our speaker is Tiffany Coulson, who's a public librarian at the NCW Libraries in Washington State and an embedded librarian at Altera, an educational nonprofit. I'm Tom Dodson, and I'll be the conference committee member moderating the session. Before I hand things over to the presenter, I just want to quickly point out that we'll be answering questions at the end of the session, but you can submit your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. If you don't see that bar, you should be able to make it appear by hovering your cursor at the button of the Zoom screen. There is also a chat button there that you can use for comments or discussion, or if you're having some tech issues, but please use the Q&A button for asking questions. Presenters will answer those at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll pass things along to Tiffany.
Great, thanks so much, Thomas. Let me go ahead and share screen here so that you can see the slides that I'm working from. All right. So welcome to Shining a Light on Gray Literature. Thomas was asking me, he couldn't find my institution, and I said that's because I work outside of academia, and is one of the reasons that I have to rely on gray literature for a lot of the work that I do. My name is Tiffany Coulson, and as Thomas mentioned, I work as a public librarian for NCW Libraries, which is geographically the largest library in the state of Washington. We cover 5 counties and all rural areas. And I work also as part-time as an embedded librarian for Altera Ed, which is an educational nonprofit. And since we'll be talking about information that orbits outside traditional publication and distribution channels, you should know that I also participate in that process as a peer reviewer for several organizations, the National Science Teachers Association, the American Educational Research Association, and also the American Society for Engineering Education. I'm a peer reviewer for all three of those organizations. So with this quote, information only becomes valuable when it is understood, not just when it is made available. And I've heard a couple of presenters today talk about the fact that access isn't enough, right? Information curation is a great librarian skill, but the interpretation of that information by a human agent is necessary before that information becomes knowledge. Knowledge incorporates experience, context, and understanding with information for the potential to create impact or change. So as a librarian, I love a good story, and I especially love looking for those stories that are embedded in cold, hard data streams and the information that comes from them. I rely on feminist theory to help me co-create meaning with experts at all levels of the knowledge management process. And when we look at research, we think we know who the experts are because those are the folks with their, at the beginning of the citation, right? But I feel it's necessary to rely on more than just the authors and researchers to enact change in the organizations that I work with. So as we go through the presentation today, I want you to think to yourself about the different information journeys that maybe you encounter professionally or in other work that you do as an information professional, and think about who the experts are and how you get access to that information from those experts in the your sphere of information. So we'll talk more about that as we go. So gray literature, for some folks, that's difficult to define. If you want to learn more about journal, it's graynet.org. But in general, gray literature is that which is produced on all levels of government, academics, business, and industry in print and electronic formats, which is not controlled by commercial publishers. And technically that, includes open access publications as well. And I'm just going to summarize a little bit. Information is something that librarians can get plenty of. And I'm hoping what I'm really going to share today is not information. You don't need to know more about gray literature. What you need to know is how that applies to what I do as a librarian and how you might be able to contextualize it for what you do as well. So one of the reasons that I use gray literature is because it's accessible. And we're talking about a lot about access today, that gray literature is outside the publication cycle, which means it's open access, no paywall. And for someone who works for a nonprofit, that's important to us. We can't pay for every article we're interested in looking at. It can be shared. Even if I do pay for an article, I can't share it with my colleagues. So I'm looking for things that can be shared with colleagues. And timeliness, that's been really important this year, and we'll talk more about that. But the information needs to be timely. It needs to be more recent content. I ran into some of these barriers just this last weekend with the nonprofit I work for. We had found a terrific article that was published in 2020, so we're thinking pretty recent. But when I did a little bit of research, I found out that that program had been awarded in 2016, implemented in 2017. It took, through the research process, it took till 2020 for it to be published. So we were looking at a program which, it was 7 years old. And not that we couldn't use that information, but in some situations, we really need things that are more recent, which means we have to find things that are outside that research publication cycle. So I just want to share some of the things that I do in my normal everyday librarian life: grant writing, curriculum design, and reference. And I've listed some of the different kinds of publications that I use. For me, especially with grant writing, we're required to use peer-reviewed research for validity, but we are also permitted to use reports that are based on peer-reviewed research, like the What Works Clearinghouse reports. Some of you who've applied for federal grants would be familiar with those. What I want to do is share with you some of my experience. So I work for an after-school nonprofit in Washington State, and during the pandemic, when the schools shut down, after-school programs really struggled to stay relevant. We were challenged with how to engage students in informal learning opportunities, how to support school curriculum without competing for online space, because schools said, hey, kids have already been online 6 hours, we don't need the after-school program doing that as well, right? And we needed to also, support the new home environment reality that kids were living in. And so I turned to gray literature to inform the direction that Altera Ed would take in providing out-of-school enrichment. And we had a really short timeline that we needed to be looking at, but we wanted something that was meaningful, something that was really going to inform a significant change that we were making in our program. So I drew upon entities that were founded in research practices and had the authority to publish articles that contextualized what they had been doing for years, their experience and their research, and help us to kind of see how it might affect the new realities of, imposed upon educational arenas by COVID-19. So using peer-reviewed research, these organizations were positioned to inform, a brand new educational landscape. One of them is NYU's Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. And they talked about the fact that culturally relevant learning was really positioned in a place that would be meaningful for the COVID-19 realities of education. And it's education that is responsive to students' individual and collective lived experiences. So the reports that they had been putting out early in the pandemic really informed. That was one of the things that we were interested in looking at is how can we be more culturally responsive to students who are no longer in school. The other was CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. They also steeped in research and experience. They recognized that physical distancing, when that was deemed necessary, meant that social and emotional connectedness was even more critical, and we picked up on that. And these observations were made early in the pandemic, really preceding evidence of a rise in mental health crises among youth and the inequities faced by marginalized students in remote learning situations. So I was using gray literature, which actually was based in peer-reviewed research, to inform, changes that needed to impact our organization in a timely manner. So, that change, we turned our programming away from a focus on our organization, Altera Ed, and sent programming into the home where we were able to affirm heritage language use, where we put families at the center of the learning transaction, where we reorganized with place-based content, and where our programming was collaborative, communicative, and connected to the home. In a way, gray literature actually became my way of having a collaborative information space virtually for knowledge building. The other thing I wanted to point out is, in addition to relying on gray literature, we also wanted to make sure that we were informing what we did by including students and families in that knowledge and information sharing. So we saw students and families as knowledge workers in these new processes. We produced was essentially our own gray literature by asking for feedback from program participants. And part of culturally relevant programming is reconsidering, who the teacher is. And our students gave us some great examples to learn from. One that I was really struck by was a young woman who said that, a teenager said, I'm babysitting a lot, and the books and information that we were sending in, she was using to read to her siblings and the kids that she was babysitting for. We had younger kids who were teaching their cousins about fossils and butterflies. So all of that, the peers in that situation, instead of being fellow students, were their families, their grandma, their cousins, their siblings. So, which brings me to kind of another reason that gray literature is really important to the work that I do as a librarian, and that's the authenticity of a lot of gray literature. And I just want to point out, I've attended a lot of sessions today on using or publishing open access research. It's peer reviewed, accessible, and able to be shared. So why still rely on gray literature, right? There are a couple reasons, and this is one of them. I chose the term authentic to describe the kind of gray literature that I'm drawn to, since it pushes beyond traditional research to more grassroots perspectives and really opens the door to practitioners. So I'm looking for gray literature that celebrates individual voice, affirms non-dominant perspectives, that's independent of publishing bias, and highlights corroboration across contexts. And like I said, it's more contextualized. It's practitioners versus researchers. It's always nice when those are the same people, but that doesn't happen that often. So here's just some examples. During the past 2 years, when huge changes have been made in education, I've relied on the perspective of educational practitioners who focus on culturally relevant practices. And by culturally relevant, I mean cultural competence, accessible language, focusing on the needs of culturally and linguistically diverse learners, use of accessible, rigorous content, and use of communication that magnifies individual voices. So these experts in various disciplines rely on research themselves, but their blogs, books, podcasts, websites are all gray literature that I accessed to inform my own experience and need for change. And I did also access, open access research that was out there that I could find. So you see here magazines, reports, conference proceedings, websites, podcasts. And you see there's Zaretta Hammond, who wrote Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, Dr. Goldie Mohammed, who wrote Cultivating Genius. So all of these became really important to me as I was trying to, pivot and change the direction that the nonprofit I was working for was going, and also informed my librarianship in my rural community. I'm going to give you just a really simple example of one way that gray literature was used to inform a school district's decision on how to return to in-person learning. So in the fall of 2021, just right before Christmas, national experts declared an emergency in children's mental health. our local school district struggled with a decision about whether they should reopen schools for face-to-face instruction. So who are the experts? I asked that earlier. Who are the experts in the information, journeys that you're going on? And in this situation, state leaders, are they the experts? Absolutely they are. National organizations, yes. Mental health professionals, yes. Teachers unions, counselors, parent groups, all yes, as experts. But one of the things that feminist theory does is look for absent voices, and the very obvious absent voices were students. How would the opinion of students and the experience of students inform that decision for the organization? So I was hired to look at gray literature for context, and then find a way to amplify student voices to help guide the analysis of open-ended questions regarding remote learning. We didn't ask them specific questions. We just said, what was the best thing about remote learning? What was the hardest thing about remote learning? And we let them respond. We wanted authentic statements, not responses to closed survey questions created by adults. And the statements by students really ended up creating an impact as the district considered a more inclusive and sensitive design towards reopening. In gray literature, that had been a report that was published just the year before the pandemic. That particular school district had 24% of kids in grades 6 through 12 that had reported having been bullied that year. Just about that many also said that they had stayed home at one point because they had felt unsafe at school. LGBTQ harassment had increased from 8 to 14% of 8th graders over a 2-year period. So when we started, coding several hundred entries of students who voluntarily, responded to these questions along with their parents, we had a lot of kids who said, I don't care if I ever go back to school. I don't get in trouble anymore. I have no more problems. I'm calmer at home. And so it was a situation where, again, looking for those opportunities and using gray literature to contextualize questions that were important for impacting change became a really important skill to have. In our programs at Altera Ed, we did something similar using gray literature for context, and then asked teens to share the benefits of activities we sent into their home during the pandemic. So again, we framed the survey questions as open-ended questions inviting discussion rather than a multiple choice information gathering exercise. So it opened the door to considering impact we hadn't anticipated. And it was more like an asynchronous discussion format that included students as contributors to program goals and future program development by making them part of a catalyst for change. Students reported, again, these were very open-ended, about, which activities did you like? And we had students report that the art activities distracted me from my struggles. The coloring book helped me calm down and go to sleep, helped me keep my brain in check. This was not something we anticipated. So again, using gray literature as for context from Castle and the Center for Educational Effectiveness, and then being able to ask the right questions, open-ended questions, and look for coded items based on that gray literature was really helpful in helping us change the things that we were doing and sending into the home. So one final story about including gray literature for data-driven impact, and this is probably the most significant one and the one that I really based a lot of my work off of. When I'm asked to help with innovating programs in the organizations where I work, I try to build opportunities for impact onto information concepts. One of them is feminist research methodology for producing recommendations for action from within a community. And the other one is a knowledge management framework, which includes stakeholders as information co-creators rather than research subjects. So both of those are really important. And I just wanted to summarize some of my guiding principles for analyzing information and looking for gray literature. And how I use gray literature. So knowledge management means stakeholders are co-creators of knowledge, that the collaborative information spaces are essential for knowledge building, and that a human agent is needed to create knowledge. So, aggregations of survey software are not knowledge building, right? That's just more information. And feminist methodology slides into knowledge management really well, since it positions individual voice as being really important. that it acknowledges absent voices, that all meaning is mediated, which means those information processes are as important as the information artifacts. How did the information, how was it solicited? How did it come to be collected? Who collected it and who provided the information are all important. Multiple valid viewpoints are important rather than just one research hypothesis, as you would see in research, and polyvocality is essential to knowledge building. So in many ways, these guiding principles make me a pretty tough peer reviewer, I will say, particularly when submissions claim to research diverse populations, but never really reach beyond their own perspectives or include those diverse populations and don't employ processes in their research designed to benefit non-dominant populations. So that's part of my, feminist land when I peer review, especially for folks who say that they're studying diverse populations. I just want you to consider this before I finish with my final story. So if you're seeking impact and organizational change, this is something to keep in mind if you're working in an organization that may disproportionately present the views of a dominant group. And so I would argue really that's every organization, isn't it? The experiences of the oppressed, no matter how diverse, produce more accurate account of the social order than do the accounts of the dominant group. So finding meaning beyond the constraints which discount non-dominant voices is important to me and is one of the things I look for in gray literature. This is a project I worked on about 5 years ago. I worked as a volunteer helping an online social platform assemble recommendations for action to global leaders regarding women's internet use. So I took a knowledge management approach rather than a research-based approach to turning information into knowledge that can impact global change. This research called for action, not 7 years of waiting and processes, and sometimes I only had weeks to provide information to UN Women or Access Now or for a global conference. So I was looking at women as knowledge workers rather than research subjects. And I was processing it ended up over a year's time, 600 journal entries from women around the world in 71 countries and 5 languages. Huge amount of qualitative data over a year's time, and then coding and analyzing those in order to have the women provide those recommendations for action to global leaders. And I wanted to show you one of the things that I did want to show you during this presentation was a terrific open access qualitative tool called 19. And unfortunately, when I went to bring it up so I could show it to you, for obvious reasons, it's been removed while they find a new hosting site because it has the number 19 in it. Really has messed things up for them. So they say it will be back by the end of the year. It's based on a flat file spreadsheet format that allows you to dynamically change, sort, look at keywords, and do data visualization that is extremely quick and allows for analysis by one researcher instead of having to, learn a lot of software. So if you look at my LinkedIn profile, and I'll have that at the end of the presentation, you can see 19 in action. But this particular slide shows all of the entries that we had that were coded for violence against women. And you can see they're across contexts, a lot of different countries, and I was able to drill down to the individual recommendations there. So visual analysis allowed me to look at themes that emerged across contexts and highlight their importance. When we presented the recommendations at the Internet Governance Forum in Istanbul, violence against women was one of the top 5 barriers to internet access, according to our analysis of statements by women. And we were told by conference participants that it was the first time violence against women had been mentioned as a major barrier to internet use by women. We had to submit our research methodology in order to be heard, and so it had to be based on scholarly principles and validity. And again, it brings forward the idea, why had this never been presented before? Because who are the experts? Are they the researchers? Are they the leaders in communities, are they, political leaders? No, they're the grassroots women that were able to inform change and using those recommendations. So, just as a summary, I just kind of showed you a small menu of some of the ways that gray literature can be used to impact change in small and large organizations. So when you're using gray literature to create impact, you're looking for who are the experts on the subject, not just the person at the beginning of a citation. Collecting that which is relevant and current, using resources you can see and share, listening to the experts in the room, those participants that are in the room with you that can contribute to that knowledge building. And then also not being afraid to produce gray literature, based on valid methods that speaks to your context, because that gray literature may not be out there and it might be useful to someone else. And then using accessible resources and valid methods to analyze and tell your data story. So librarians can be a change. Librarians can be a resource for change in your libraries, connecting to your communities or within your organization, and lighting the way to finding or producing gray literature that you use to inform organizational change is the way that librarians can do that. Thanks for listening to that. A lot of information in a little bit of time, a lot of experience. I hope that maybe piqued some interest. And you're welcome to look more at some of the things that I've done on my LinkedIn profile. And I'm happy to answer questions about gray literature and maybe a little bit about research and experience using gray literature as a librarian.
Thank you so much for sharing this approach to doing research and developing knowledge. The Q&A is open, and if folks have questions, I'll be happy to read them so that Tiffany can respond. I have kind of an odd question. This is going to probably date me. I have librarians of my generation. I guess I'm in my 40s. There was a period of time, and it's kind of still going, when folks were really interested in zines and developing collections of zines.
Right.
Do you see that as a kind of gray literature that connects to this notion of authenticity that you've been talking about?
100%. 100%. It's just, so when we were collecting journal entries from World Pulse, we had all kinds of journal entries that came to us, but they were collected from different kinds of media. So they could have been something that kids were texting using SMS. They could have been a zine. They could have been photographs that someone took in rural Afghanistan. All of those count as journal entries. We just had to have a place for them to land. And when you have zines, which definitely elevates those and that highlights those individual voices and unique experiences of people, it definitely can be a place where a kind of gray literature that can contribute depending on the topic of the zine. I know Salt Lake City Public Library has a terrific zine collection that's ongoing, and I know that there's research out there, but I'm not sure if anyone has looked at it as a knowledge building tool, and it definitely could be.
Yeah, I was thinking of a couple of people I know who have that run this thing called QZAP, which is an online queer zine archive project. So
right, absolutely. No,
and those
absolutely.
are voices that might not circulate in quite the same way.
Well, and you bring up an interesting group of folks that when we were doing the online submissions for the women's barriers to internet access, it was from 71 countries all over the world, and in a lot of countries LGBTQ communities are suppressed online. People are afraid to show up in online spaces because it could be physically dangerous for them. It could be, it's illegal in some countries. And we had 3 women out of all those 600 women, 3 women who were curating underground online spaces for LGBTQ communities. I think it was China, Bahrain, and can't remember the other one. Even though those topics had not been, and that group of folks had not been, information about them had not been solicited by our campaign partners. I highlighted that as one of the major recommendations, because there were people that were putting themselves at risk in order to share those information spaces, and it's super important. And I love the idea of online zine project that highlights that community.
Well, we're scheduled to go until 4:10, and I guess I'm waiting for another one of the organizers to transition us into the conclusion of the conference. But I'm going to close this session, but I don't think anybody would mind if folks kept posting chat questions and things like that. So I'm going to put a stop to the recording.